Hello, everyone, and welcome to Artist Spotlight, the webinar series from the Maryland Photography Alliance. In continuing our tradition of bringing great and wonderful artists to you, today's webinar will be presented by Cole Thompson. And Cole's topic today will be why black and white. Artist Spotlight was created when COVID hit earlier in the year, and we launched the program primarily for two reasons. One was for education, because many of our clubs were shutting down and not providing continuing education to its members, and also for community support. With regards to helping support the community, the Maryland Food Bank, there are so many people in dire need today. 1 in 4 Marylanders are facing food insecurity. So at the end of the webinar, if you like what you hear and see, we would ask for a voluntary donation. We're proud to announce we've raised over $14,000 so far through Artist Spotlight, which has helped provide over 42,000 meals. Now we can finally get to Cole's introduction. This is going to sound a little unusual, but Cole Thompson is uniquely unqualified to speak on photography. And I'm quoting Cole right now when he says, "I've never taken a photography class or a workshop. I don't have a degree in art. I've never worked as a photographer. I am not represented by a gallery. I'm not a Canon Explorer of light. I have only 3 lenses and none of them are primes. Do I have any qualifications? Just one, my images. Nothing else matters." And without further ado, it's my honor to turn it over to Cole. And Cole's going to bring up his PowerPoint and will turn off his video during his presentation. So sit back, everyone, and here we go. Cole, it's all yours.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me out. And I wished I could see you all. I'm used to Zoom where I can see little thumbnails of everybody, but hi, and I hope there's a few friends out there. Let's get right into it. This presentation is called Why Black and White, but it's really about so much more, which you'll see in a minute. So let me turn off my video, share my screen. And let's get started. Let me just move this little window out of the way. Okay, so my presentation is called Why Black and White? And to understand black and white, we must first examine the history of black and white. We need to undertake a comparative and historical analysis with an emphasis on the relative intrinsic value of the inherent intermodal causeways of the medium when compared to other artistic disciplines. Wow. Unfortunately for you, this is an incredibly long and boring part of the presentation. So let's get started. In the beginning, all art was in black and white. But then color was created and the world turned colorful. But then photography was invented and it turned back to black and white. And then Kodacolor was invented and it turned back to color. The end. The history of photography, black and white. How many of you would buy a 3-legged dog? Or get on an airplane with only one wing? Or buy a car with no wheels? So why would we then take a perfectly good color image and strip it of all color? Why? It would be like driving a Model T in a Tesla world, or using wet plates in a digital world. It would be like owning a 3-legged dog, just somehow incomplete. I'd like to tell you about my journey to black and white, why I love it so much, and why you might consider it. My journey begins in 1968. I was a 14-year-old boy living in Rochester, New York, the home of Kodak. And I was out for a hike one day with a friend, and we stumbled across this old ruin of a house. My friend told me that it was once owned by George Eastman, and that piqued my interest. And so I checked out his biography from the school library and began reading. And as I read that book, before I'd ever finished, I fell in love with photography. And I just felt that I was destined to become a photographer. Now that sounds silly. A 14-year-old boy who's never yet taken a picture and who has never seen that magic moment when a print comes up in the darkroom. So for the next 10 years, photography was literally everything I did in life was related to photography. If I wasn't shooting, I was working in the darkroom. And if I wasn't doing that, I was studying the works of the great masters. And as I looked at those images, there was a particular type of image I was drawn to. They were dark images. They were contrasty images. They were images that caused a shiver to go down my spine when I saw a great image. And they were images that inspired me and made me want to create images like that. This is my first fine art image, created at age 14 on my mother's prized dining room table. So a lot of people ask, but Cole, why black and white? You were born into a color world. And I tell them, no, I was born into a black and white world. When I was a child, television was all in black and white. Movies were in black and white. The news was delivered in black and white. And my childhood heroes were in black and white. And even our nation was still segregated into black and white. And so I created images, perhaps reflective of the world I grew up in. I'm not really sure why I love black and white so much, but for me, color records the image, but black and white records the feelings that lie beneath the surface. Or put another way, color is a happy meal, black and white is fine dining. So what do I look for in a great black and white image? Well, as mentioned, I love a dark image. I love a glowing subject. I love detail, especially when enhanced by contrast. I love shapes, form, patterns, and textures. I love simple images, and increasingly my images are getting more and more simple. And I love using long exposures to simplify them with water, with sky, and even with people. This is the angel Gabriel, and it's what I call my most significant image because it was the first time that I had created an image from my vision. I didn't just take a picture. I was photographing on the Newport Beach Pier in Southern California, and the pier was crowded with hundreds of people walking past. But because I was using a long exposure, the people disappeared. And while the image was interesting, it lacked something. And so I looked around for a subject, and I saw this man eating French fries out of a trash can. I approached him and asked him if he would stand in for the photograph. I would be happy to take him to lunch. And he was very suspicious, but reluctantly agreed. He wanted to hold his Bible, and this is the image that we used. Afterwards, we went to a 4-star restaurant, and his name was Gabriel. And Gabriel was barefoot, filthy, with matted hair, and of course the looks we got. As we sat down to eat, I said, Gabriel, order anything that you like. And he said, well, I'd love a steak with onions and mushrooms. I haven't had one in years. And when the waitress brought it, he picked it up with his hands and ate it. Gabriel had been a drug addict, but was now clean, but was impaired by the experience. He was Romanian and had come from Romania, and I'm half Romanian, so we talked about the old country and my family name. He was a delightful fellow, and I found out that his father lived nearby. So as we departed, I said, Gabriel, give me your father's name and address, and I'd be happy to share any of the proceeds from sales of this image. And he replied, give it to someone who can really use it. I have everything that I need. And Gabriel walked off with his only 2 possessions, his Bible and a bedroll. I go back to Southern California several times a year and always go back to the Newport Beach Pier looking for Gabriel, but have never seen him again. So how do you learn to photograph in black and white? Here's what I do. I put my camera into monochrome mode and raw mode. It's got to be both. When it's in monochrome mode, you can see the image in black and white on the back of your camera. Very useful for imagining what the image will look like. But because it's in raw, it'll come in as a color image in Photoshop. And I want it to be in color because I want to be the one who interprets it to black and white. Then learn how colors translate into shades of gray, because black and white is all about contrast. And even more importantly, learn how to manipulate those colors into different shades of gray. In the black and white conversion process, you can actually take these color sliders and change the shades of gray. Then think in terms of shapes, contrast, and composition, because that's really what a black and white image is all about. So what subjects look great in black and white? Some people feel there are certain subjects that should be reserved for color. I personally think they all look great in black and white, except one. Color paint samples definitely should be in color. So tonight I'd like to give you a sampling of some of my work by showing you images from each of my different portfolios, interspersed with my photographic philosophies. Now let's talk about a portfolio. It's simply a group of images that are related or tell a story. For years, I resisted working in portfolios. I called myself a photographic grazer, and I just like to wander about and shoot whatever caught my eye. And I created some good images, what I would call greatest hits or one-hit wonders, but they weren't related. There was nothing that held them together. They didn't tell a story. Well, a few years later, I decided to submit my work to Lenswork. And the submission guidelines are pretty simple. Send 15 to 25 images on a single subject. Do not send us your greatest hits. Well, I thought to myself, well, he's never seen my greatest hits, and off they went. Well, I came back within just days with this big hand-scribbled note that said, pick one image and send me 15. And that was the kick I needed to begin my very first portfolio, which was grain silos. Here out in Colorado, grain silos or grain bins are the center of every town and the center of every family farm. But I wanted to photograph them not as objects of utility, but rather as objects of art. I had been a machinist as one of my very first careers, and I loved metals. And when the sun hits these grain bins, the reflections and the highlights. And so I spent several months just traveling the Eastern Plains, photographing these grain silos. Now, I've heard you don't consider yourself a photographer. I don't. I think of myself as an artist who uses photography. For 35 years, I thought of myself as a photographer, though. And as a photographer, I almost worshiped my equipment. I was one of those guys who always had the best gear, the most gear, and always had it first. But now as an artist, my God is the image, and my camera is simply a tool. As a photographer, I thought my goal was to show you what my eyes saw, and I thought manipulation was a dirty word. But as an artist, my goal is to show you what I'm seeing through my vision. There's nothing wrong with documenting or wanting to be a photographer, but I want to create. Melting giants. A few years back, I was in Nova Scotia photographing, and I just overheard a conversation. Two men were talking about the icebergs that were in Newfoundland. And so the next year, off I went. It was a 9,000-mile road trip from Colorado, and it was a wonderful trip. And while there, I saw these incredible icebergs that start their lives in Greenland. They take 9 to 12 months going counterclockwise until they come along the coast of Newfoundland, where they break up into smaller pieces, beach themselves, rock in the surf, and then break up into 30,000-year-old ice cubes. And I thought this was a terribly sad story, the short life of these icebergs. And so I created a series that was very dark with very high contrast, showing the last moments of life of these great icebergs. And as I mentioned, these are 30,000-year-old ice cubes that melt on shore. Now here's the conditions that I was typically photographing in, very bright blue skies, pretty weather. And if you look off into the distance, on the far right at the horizon, you'll see an iceberg. And that iceberg is probably 3 to 4 times the size of an aircraft carrier. But then they break up into these smaller pieces and they just beach themselves, rocking in the surf until they break up and melt. Ansel Adams. For most young kids my age back in the 60s, Ansel Adams was our hero. And not only did I love his work, but I tried to imitate it. Not just the look. I'd actually had gone to Yosemite and tried to stand where Ansel had stood to recreate his images. There was nothing greater than someone saying to me, "Your work reminds me of Ansel Adams." And I would just beam with pride. Well, a few years ago, I went to review Santa Fe. That's where you spend a day showing your work to experts in the field. And as I was going to the last reviewer of a very, very long day, he was tired, I was tired. I showed him my work. He just very briefly looked at it and then brusquely pushed it back to me and said, "It looks like you're trying to copy Ansel Adams." And I said proudly, "I am. I love Ansel Adams." And he then said something that would change my photography and my life. He said, "Ansel already did Ansel. What can you do that exhibits your unique vision?" That was like a blow to the head. I suddenly realized, was it my ambition in life to become known as the world's best Ansel Adams imitator? Can you imagine Stephen introducing me tonight and saying, "I'd like to introduce Cole Thompson. He is the world's best Ansel Adams imitator." Monoliths. If you've ever been to the Oregon coast, about mid-coast, there's a little town called Bandon, Oregon. And it's got a 2-mile stretch of very flat beach with these incredible monoliths that just jut out from the sand. They call them sea stacks out there. And so for the last 15 years, I go every September to photograph these monoliths. The thing about going back to a same location year after year is that not only do I see different light and different weather, but my vision is also different. So every year I have a little bit different take on these monoliths. So vision, what is it? I'd heard people talk about it. Is it a style that you develop? Is it a look or a technique? Is it a creative talent that you're born with? Is it something that some people have and others don't? And it turns out that it's none of those things. Vision is simply the sum total of our life experiences that allows us to see the world in a unique way. Let me put it another way. Imagine if you could take everything you've been taught, everything you've experienced, everything that you believe, and put it into a blender, and take that mix and cast lenses that you then see the world through. And what you see through those life lenses is your vision. It's just how you see the world, how you like it. Vision is not learned or developed, but rather vision is discovered and followed. And the most important thing I learned about vision is that we all have a vision. In fact, you can't not have one. Isolated. This is a simple portfolio about isolation, and I use trees to express it. And these trees are from all over the world. And the thing is that you can sometimes be around others, but you still feel isolated. I tend not to say too much about what my projects mean. I like people to just, I guess, see and feel them for themselves. This is an interesting spot in New Brunswick. It's called the Bay of Fundy. And it's famous because it has the highest tides in the world, over 55 feet. And when I got there, the tide was out, and I was disappointed because I really wanted to photograph that structure. So I waited, and I had to wait till about midnight. And I just sat down at the base of the stairs until finally the water was lapping at my tripod, and it was so dark, I had to do an 8-minute exposure using a pen light to try to illuminate the detail on those side hills. So how did I find my vision? I didn't even understand what vision was, so how could I find it? Yes, I heard people using the word. I'd even bantered it about. So I generally kind of knew, but it was like this wisp of smoke that I just couldn't grasp. And so I just came up with 10 steps that I thought would help me find out if I had a vision. Now, I didn't have any idea what I was doing. There were no books on how to find your vision. I was really just flying by the seat of my pants. The first thing I did was I printed out my work and I separated it into two piles. In the left pile, I put images that I really, really loved. And in the other pile went everything else. That included images that had won contests, had sold well, had been published. If I couldn't say that I really loved that image, it could not go in that left-hand pile. Next, I committed to never again produce work that I didn't really love. I would never produce an image just because I knew it would sell or win. I practiced photographic celibacy, a somewhat controversial concept. I don't look at the work of other photographers. I used to spend so much time bathing in other people's vision that I didn't really know what I thought. So I decided that I had to wipe that blackboard clean as much as I could and try to focus on how I saw things. I changed my mindset from photographer to artist. I had been raised not believing that I was creative. And I realized that if I was going to be creative, I had to first believe that it was possible. I stopped caring. This is the hardest. I stopped caring what other people thought of my work. Too often I had used my work to win, to get likes, to be acknowledged. And I had to start saying, what do I love? And I don't care what anyone else thinks of it. It took me 2 long, hard, gut-wrenching years to find my vision, and I finally did. Now I'd like to show you just a little glimpse into my vision by showing you before and after images, what the eye saw versus what my vision saw. Let's start with the angel Gabriel, the very first image that I felt that I had created. Here's the before and the after. Now, as I stood there, I imagined and I knew what that image would look like. And so that directed me as I took the shot and as I post-processed it. Vision is like a roadmap that guides you. This is called skeleton, and it's just a pile of bones that I found along the river in my hometown. But as I saw that with my eyes, you can see the challenge, the very bright leaves against the bright bones. But in my mind, I knew how it was going to turn out. And so the only thing I had to do is technically figure out how to do it, the easy part. This is a recent image called the Jim Bridger Power Plant from Wyoming, shot on a very cold, very sunny day. And Windmill in Moonlight, shot near Grand Island, Nebraska. The challenge here was that it was a very bright moon, and it had just snowed, so it was very reflective. And I had such a difference in exposure from the top half of the scene to the bottom half. So I simply took 2 shots, one exposed for the top, one exposed for the bottom, and combined them. A lot of people say, after seeing your before and after images, I realized that I need to learn more about Photoshop. And that is exactly not my point. Some people believe that you need to have great technical skills before you can express your vision. Boy, I disagree with that wholeheartedly. I say first find your vision and then learn the skills needed to express it. When I created the images from Auschwitz-Birkenau, I had no idea how to create ghosts from other people. But I had the vision. I knew what the images were going to look like. The vision was the hard part. The technical was the easy part. There's the before and after. Now this is from Bandon, from the monoliths. Sometimes, it's very simple what you do. And what I love about black and white is you can bring out this great detail that's not always visible to the eye or even to the color image. This is a recent image from Idaho, from my Powerline series. And clouds, shot a mile from my home. What I love about black and white also is that you can get rid of atmospheric so easily. The road to nowhere. I was creating a how-to video, how to shoot in black and white for a company, and we were shooting in Death Valley. And they were videotaping me as I was driving along when I saw this scene, and we discussed the seeing of the scene, the vision I had, the shot, and then the post-processing. And that led to a series called The Road to Nowhere. Just a very simple concept. The Alabama Hills, which is not in Alabama. The Faroe Islands. These road to nowheres are everywhere. And the Faroe Islands again. and Death Valley. So my processing is very simple. I typically use 6 tools in Photoshop. These are the 6 steps that I use. I don't use layers. I don't use plugins. I don't use black and white conversion programs. I just use Photoshop in these 6 steps. Let me show you how I process one of my images. The first thing I do is I bring it in to Photoshop Raw and just tweak those little, I hope my mouse is showing, those little sliders till the image looks about how I envision it. Then I convert it to black and white. And what I love about the black and white conversion tool is that I can change. It's almost like adding color filters after the fact. I can change the gray value of many colors by using those color sliders. Then I adjust my levels. And this is such an important step for black and white. So many people look at their screen and say, I have a true black and a true white in this image. But then it looks terrible when printed. And they'll send it to me and I'll look at their histogram and see that there is not a true black or a true white. As you can see in this image, there's no true black in it. So I can adjust that there with levels. Next, I dodge and burn using a Wacom tablet and pen. And I work just like I did in the darkroom, dodging and burning. And what I love about dodging and burning is I can go into just a single small area and affect it without globally affecting the entire image. Next, I add contrast. And for black and white, this helps it print well. Often an image looks flat when printed when compared to the screen, and adding contrast helps bring that print up to the same level. And then I remove the spots because I always have a dirty sensor. There's the before and after. Now, if you'd like to see a short video of a demonstration of my post-processing, just go to my website, go to the blog, and search for Photoshop and 6 tools. Popular Photography called me the Photoshop heretic because I did everything wrong. And the truth is, I was always so embarrassed at my ultra simple processing that I would never let any of my friends see me work. They had these incredibly elaborate processes with layers and masks and plugins, and I just felt like I was the village idiot with this 6-step process. But then I realized nothing matters but the final image. And any way that you use Photoshop is the right way for you. And I'd like to share my secret to post-processing. Very important. It's knowing what you want to do, not knowing how to do it. That vision component is the most important part of post-processing because it's that roadmap that shows you what to do. Anyone can learn the techniques. Albert Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Trees from a train. In the mid-70s, I lived in Alaska, but had never returned. Always sad about that. Well, last October, a good friend, Jim Norman, he's up your guys' way. I don't know if you know Jim, but he said, I've got one of those buy one, get one free tickets, and I'm going to Alaska. Would you like to join me? And I said, I sure would. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do in Alaska, but there was one thing I really did want to do. Take that train ride from Fairbanks to Anchorage, a 12-hour train ride through this really incredibly rugged country. And we were lucky because on our trip, we had a good blizzard going, and it was a wonderful time. Now, the first thing you do when you get on the train is you sit at the window and you point your camera out and you say, what can I photograph? Well, it's pretty tough. It's snowing, trees are whizzing past, and if you do see a scene off in the distance, it's soon gone or the trees are moving in front of you. So I went between 2 cars and opened the windows on each side so I could photograph out each window. And I just started photographing the trees. They were the most obvious subject. Then I started panning the trees. Then I thought to myself, what would happen if I used a long exposure and panned? And I started getting these incredible effects. This swirling and distortion that I couldn't really account for, I didn't understand, but it was fun. And by varying different elements, I could get different effects. And just had a blast for 12 hours photographing these trees out the window. And I later learned that the key to the swirling was the focal plane shutter that most of us have in our single lens reflexes. Won't work with an electronic shutter or a leaf shutter. Anyway, I just had a blast shooting this trees from a train. And this image was in last month's issue of Lenswork. So when you go to a new location, how do you prepare? I don't. I literally do two things. I book a flight and book a car, and then I just drive. I don't like to have hotels booked because that ties you down to a certain location. I just like to go where my eye takes me in the hope that I'll see something that inspires me. And that's what I did when I went to Iceland for a month. I never look at the iconic locations. I never look at other photographers' work. I don't want to know the iconic locations because those have been photographed a million times before. And I hope that I create my own iconic locations. Now, ironically, I photographed this and found out later it was one of the iconic locations, but I didn't know that. And so for a month, I just traveled around Iceland. And the one thing I did know about Iceland was they had this bay where these icebergs came out of. And I wanted to shoot there, but when I got there, they were having the storm of the century. They had winds of 137 miles per hour. So I could barely get out of my car and get this one shot. And then as I traveled, I hit those winds, which threatened to roll my car. It blew out all my windows and stripped the car of paint. I was driving about 5 to 10 miles per hour following the stripe in the road. And at some points, I lost the stripe and I didn't know where I was at. And later, a friend sent me this photo, which explained why I lost the stripe. The top layer of asphalt literally blew away. Ancient stones. This is a project that began in Joshua Tree and has been largely photographed in Joshua Tree in the Alabama hills. And it's about these ancient stones that I believe are somehow alive, and they just sit and watch us over the eons, watching humans scurry about full of self-importance. And they just are the constant. And this is an open project that I just keep adding to. Do you dance? I heard this story on the radio. It was told by an emergency room physician who was working on the Navajo Indian reservation. And he was working one Saturday when an old man with long gray braided hair came in and just stood there. And the physician grabbed a clipboard and went up to him and said, "Can I help you?" And the old man said nothing. And the physician, just a little perturbed, said, "Look, I can't help you unless you talk to me." And then the old man looked at him and said, "Do you dance?" And the physician thought about that. And he wondered, perhaps this was a medicine man who believed in healing through song and dance. And so he said, "No, I don't. Can you teach me?" And the old man said, "I can teach you to dance, but you must hear the music." And this struck home to me for two reasons. The first, a few years ago, my wife decided we needed to spice up the marriage by going out dancing. And so she signed us up for dance classes. And how my wife and I learned dancing was quite different. I memorized the dance steps and counted out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. My wife closed her eyes, felt the music, and flowed with it. Remember the first time we went out dancing, she said to me, "Are you going to count all night?" We learned so differently. And that makes me think about how we learn photography. We can learn the technology of photography with our mind. We can learn all about f-stops and focal lengths and depth of field and all the things we love to bathe ourselves in. But we must hear the music if we're going to do more than just take pictures. Harbinger. This is one of my favorite portfolios. My son and I, his name was Jem, and he was 13. We went on a father and son outing, and we were on I-70 in eastern Utah when I saw these great mud hills. Now, if you've ever photographed with a family member, especially kids, you know what a pain that can be. It was about 105 out, and as I told him we were going to stop, he starts the moaning and the groaning. And then as we went up to photograph, it's, you know, the loud sighs, and "Are you almost done? How much longer? You said 10 minutes ago." And what I was photographing was interesting, but like the angel Gabriel, it was lacking something. And so I was tired of him complaining, and I just said, "Fine, we're going back to the truck." And as we got back, I just glanced back to those mud hills, and I saw this incredibly great white single cloud traveling across the top of the hills very quickly. And I could see that in just a minute it would be centered right over those mud hills that I was photographing. So I yelled to him, "We're going back." And we got up there and we got the tripod out and the camera set up, and I got my one shot. And that was it. And I always name my images the first word that comes to my mind, and it was harbinger, an omen of things to come. And people would say, "I love it. Are you going to do a series on it?" And I would just laugh. What are the chances that I'm going to see single clouds over interesting locations? But it's funny, once you are attuned to something, you start seeing it. And over the years, I have created a small portfolio of harbingers. This one, I laid in that field for 3 hours, waiting for that cloud to center over that windmill, but it never did. And then I learned that there were two kinds of clouds. There's the kind that move across the sky, and then there's the kind that just form and dissipate, always in the same spot. This is over Devil's Tower in Wyoming and Tongariki in Easter Island. And I've been seeing them everywhere. Two recent additions from my trip to Arizona. So how important is equipment when creating an image? Not nearly as important as we think. Not nearly as important as your vision. A story. A famous photographer was invited to dinner by a wealthy New York socialite. She greeted him warmly at the door. "I love your photographs. You must have a wonderful camera." He said nothing. At the end of the meal, he thanked her and said, "That was a delicious meal. You must have a wonderful stove." Now, I hope you're chuckling, because we all know that a great stove does not make a great meal. But how often do we sometimes act as though our equipment is the key? If I only had this camera or that lens. If I had to choose between the world's best equipment, but I didn't have any vision, or I could just have a Kodak Brownie, but with my vision, I'll take the Kodak Brownie. This image, I was photographing at the St. Petersburg, Russia Winter Palace. Spent all afternoon photographing these trees. And when I got home, there wasn't an image that worked. And I was disappointed. But then I remembered that I had taken a single iPhone shot. And back then it was probably an 8 megapixel, tiny sensor iPhone shot that I heavily cropped and created this image. Equipment is not as important as we think it is. Ukrainians with eyes shut. My number 2 son was serving in the Peace Corps in Ukraine. And so my wife and I decided off we would go. And as is my practice, I did no preparations. I did not have any idea of what I would find in Ukraine, but I trusted there would be something that would spark a passion in me and I would come away with a project. Well, we are in about 3 days and I'm not seeing anything, and I'm starting to get a little nervous. All I can think about is how much time is left and I haven't seen a thing. There was something that piqued my interest, the people. But I always have a problem with photographing people in a foreign land. They put on a camera face, that big smile. There's no way to break it down because you don't have time to spend with the subject. And even if you did, you don't have a common language. So as I was pondering this problem, we were at a bus stop and I saw this man standing against a wall. And I approached him and I said, "America." And he nodded. I said, "Photographer." He nodded. Then using sign language, I said, "Can I take your picture?" He nodded, and I took his picture. Then I, with sign language, said, "Stop, close your eyes." And he had that puzzled look that said, "What?" And I again said with sign language, "Close your eyes." And I took his photograph. And it got rid of the camera face. And for the next week, I went around photographing Ukrainians on the street with their eyes shut. Now, I was in Lviv when this little old man, 5'0", comes shuffling up to me and asked in very broken Italian English what we were doing. We explained, and he, without a word, turned around and went away. A few minutes later, he came back, this time with a camera, and said, "Can I take your photograph?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "With your eyes closed." And as I took that closed my eyes, I was very appreciative of how trusting the Ukrainian people had been, allowing me to photograph them that way. Because once you close your eyes, you feel very vulnerable. Is this a trick? Is my stuff safe? So I was grateful. Simplify. When I decided that I wanted to be a creative photographer, an artist, and not just a photographer, I realized that I didn't have a lot of time to devote to the creative. The hardware and software issues were so consuming that, every time you updated an OS, some program wouldn't work, and then you needed new drivers, and then some firmware needed to be installed. And I decided just to simplify everything I did as a photographer. I reduced my equipment down to a single bag. Everything I own is in one bag. I got rid of all the gadgets and crud. I simplified my processes. Everything I did was as simple as can be. And what was the result? Well, as expected, I spent less time tinkering, installing, adjusting, updating, and fixing, and I had more time for the creative process. That was good. But there was an unintended consequence that I had not anticipated. I found that over time, my images were getting simpler. And that's a process that I'm still continuing, simplifying my images. The lone man. I was photographing in San Diego at La Jolla Cove at the children's pool. And it was a busy summer day, and there were a lot of people out on that stone jetty. And I was waiting for them to leave so I could get my shot. Well, I was impatient, so I finally decided I would do a test exposure. So once the people had left, I'd be all set. And all the people were out there, and I do a 30-second exposure, and I noticed that most of the people have disappeared because they were moving. But that one fellow, he stood perfectly still for 30 seconds. And then I realized that I had seen that body position, that attitude before. And it's when people stand on the edge of the world looking out into the great expanse, they become very still and very thoughtful. They think about things greater than self. And at that moment, they are alone as the lone man. And people ask, well, how'd you get people to stand still? And I tell them, they didn't even know I was photographing them. They just do. This is a special image to me because that's my daughter-in-law. She's on top of a cliff that I swear is 3 miles high. And I'm on the edge, literally on the edge of an equally high cliff. And I'm terribly fearful of heights. But what really made me nervous was that she was up there with my son and their child. And every year, several people fall to their death at the Faroe Islands. So I hear a lot of people discussing such deep topics as what is art and what is fine art. And I thought that I would weigh in with my thoughts. Who cares? I only ask myself 2 questions. Do I like it? And would it look good on my wall? Nothing else matters. A couple of years ago, a girl local to me, a senior in high school, contacted me and asked if I would shoot her senior portrait. And I was going to say no, because I just don't do that type of work. And then she said something that caught my interest. She said, I'd like something really unique that no one else has ever done. So I photographed her and called it Ingrid Surrounded. Now, I showed this to a friend who's got an MFA, and he said to me, well, Cole, that really isn't a fine art photograph. And I said, well, Russ, I never said that it was, but why? And I thought maybe there was a cow rule or something. And he said, because everyone knows that in a fine art photograph, the subject never smiles. And I thought, how pompous. Create what you love, no matter what it's called or what others think. Sometimes others may not understand or like your work, and that's okay. It's not for them. At least it shouldn't be. Self-shadows. Here's an example of work born out of love that will never win a contest, will never be published, or will never sell. But I love doing it. Everywhere I go, I create a self-shadow or a shadow selfie. And it reminds me of my trip and my location. Iceland. A recent one from Death Valley. The Alabama Hills. Tongariki, Easter Island. And this one's called I'm on the Left. I do it because I love it and it brings me joy. Don't compare your work to others. Another reason that I'm practicing photographic celibacy is that I used to spend hour upon hour looking at other people's work, and I would come away discouraged because it seemed like the world was filled with millions of great photographers, and they were all younger than I. And they had gone to locations that I had been and seen things that I didn't see. It just seems like there were so many great photographers, and all I could see was their strengths and my weaknesses. But it was an unfair comparison. One of the keys to finding your vision is learning to ignore what others are doing. Art is not a contest. It's not a race. We're not trying to be better than someone else. We're just trying to be as good as we can be and to express what we're feeling inside. And I could hear the voice of my mother. What other people are doing is none of your business. You just worry about Cole. It's amazing those phrases our parents would repeat to us so often as children, and now as an adult, they seem so wise to me. Moi at the quarry. When I was 17, I read the book Aku Aku by Thor Heyerdahl and fell in love both with Thor Heyerdahl and his adventures, but mostly with Easter Island. And as he called it, the mystery of Easter Island, how they moved those great stone monoliths. Well, a few years ago, my wife and I were creating a bucket list. And I just made the offhand comment, I'd love to go to Easter Island, but of course that's impossible. And my wife asked a very astute question, why? And so off we went. And as I tell people, going to Easter Island is not for the faint of wallet, but it is a wonderfully incredible trip. And while there, I created 3 portfolios. And this is the first one, the moi at the quarry. On Easter Island, there's about 1,000 moi, but most of them are still at the quarry in a partially unfinished state. They would carve them out of the rock, slide them down the hill and plop them into a hole so they could reach the heads and finish the heads. And for the longest time, people thought they were just heads when 2/3 were beneath the surface. And while Thor Heyerdahl thought the mystery of Easter Island is how they moved them, I think the mystery is why did they, in seemingly a day, drop their tools at the base of the moi and walk away? A question we'll never answer. So how do I pick a subject? I don't. It picks me. For the longest time, I kept a list in my pocket of project ideas. But then I realized I had never once used one of those ideas. Every project I had taken on had just hit me in a sudden burst of inspiration. I got excited, I had a passion for it, and I ran with it. Let me talk about one of those, ceiling lamps. My mother was living in Akron, Ohio, and I was staying at a hotel to visit her. And as I was checking out, I looked up into the lobby ceiling and saw this ceiling lamp. And for some reason that day, that moment, it just looked fascinating. And I stood right below it. Then I cleared the table away and lay on the floor and began to photograph it. It just fascinated me what it looked like looking straight up. And I started seeing them everywhere. I didn't photograph them as objects of utility or objects of beauty, but just straight below. And I love collecting them and arranging them in different ways. This is from my favorite Mexican restaurant in Fort Collins. And that upper right one is my Del Taco in Costa Mesa. And it was just a fun journey, going into different stores looking for unique lamps. And then recently I went to Moscow and found these 3 Soviet-era lamps in the subway. So why do I create? Well, I know why as a 14-year-old boy I created. Just the pure joy of creating to please myself. But then I started using it to get positive feedback, pats on the back. Then I argued that I needed to win a contest because I didn't have any evidence that the image was good unless it won. Then I argued I had to have a resume because no one would take me serious as a photographer if I didn't have a resume. Then I wanted to become famous, the next Ansel Adams. Then I argued I needed to make money with my photography, that it wasn't fair to use the family budget. And then some 50 years later, I've come full circle. And like that 14-year-old boy I once was, I once again create just to please myself. Sometimes I'm sad that it took me 50 years, but mostly I'm glad that I actually discovered this and I'm able once again just to create for the pure joy of creating. I do my best work when I create for myself, and I don't worry about what others think, if it'll win, if it'll sell. Linda Ronstadt, I just saw this quote last week. I mean, it's nice to be acknowledged, nice for your work to be acknowledged, but it's not what you do it for. You do it for the work. And if you're doing it for the prizes, you're in big trouble. And I couldn't agree more. The Fountainhead. Another book I read when I was 17 was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And it's a story of an architect who really flaunts popular architecture and does ultra-modern architecture in a neoclassical world. And he's ostracized and punished for it, but he won't give in. He has a vision, and that's how he creates. And so I just love that book and the whole concept of staying true to self. Well, one day I'm in San Diego in stop and go traffic, and in front of me is a minivan with a dark tinted window. And in the window, I can see the reflection of the skyscraper behind me. And it was wonderfully distorted, and I loved the look. I told my wife about it and kind of wondered, how could I create such a project? I can't chase around dark tinted minivans. And she came up with a solution. She had the idea of using a funhouse mirror that I could bend and twist to distort the buildings. And so I spent several months going around major cities in the West, photographing these buildings all distorted. And because the ferrotype plate, the funhouse mirror, would include me in the image, I had to get below it to get the shot. This is my favorite from Portland, Oregon. So what photographic rules should you follow? None, unless you want to create average images like the millions of others who are following the same rules. Do you remember paint by numbers? We were promised that if we would follow the rules, we could create a masterpiece. And the rules were simple. Use the right color, stay in the right number, and stay within the lines. Well, maybe not a masterpiece, but a competent image. You don't create a masterpiece by following the numbers or by following the rules. All you'll do is create work that is similar to everyone else's. At best, all you'll produce is an imitation. Ansel Adams said the so-called rules of composition are, in my opinion, invalid, irrelevant, immaterial. Pretty strong statement. And an ex-Ansel Adams imitator said, there are no need for rules when you have found your vision. The Dunes of Nude. Every year I go to Death Valley in January. I don't know if you saw it, but yesterday they broke the record, perhaps the world's record for a high temp, 130 degrees. Well, I go in January because it's between 65 and 75 degrees, and because the crowds are almost all gone. You rarely see a person. And I spend an hour every morning and an hour every night on the dunes when the light is low and the shadows are long. And I love photographing the dunes up close. And it always reminded me as a part of the human nude. And so I called this project the Dunes of Nude. Another ongoing project where every year your vision is just a little different and you see things just a little bit differently. And it's a wonderful place for black and white. A quiz. To create great images, you must A, go to great locations, or B, learn to see wherever you're at. Well, of course, it's obvious. Great images are found anywhere that you can see them. But presenters like myself do you a disservice because we're always coming back with images from these incredible locations all over the globe, subtly saying a great image comes from a great location. And that's just a lie. I'd like to show you images that were created within 15 minutes of my home. Skeleton, Wiggles roaring, old car interior, wrenches, flaming dahlia, railroad tracks, clouds, windsurfing, plate of leaves, 2 trees and lifting fog, Poudre River spillway, 4 silos, fluid water, angry underbelly of a storm, ceiling lamp, Morning Dove Ranch. Edward Weston, confined to a chair with Parkinson's disease, said, I should be able to look down at my feet and see something to photograph. And I agree. It's not where we're at, it's how well we're seeing. Moy standing. This is the second project from Easter Island. On Easter Island, there are only about 30 standing moy. The rest have all been toppled through war. And they are standing on 7 ahus. The ahus are these sacred altars that they sit upon, and you don't get near them or step on them. They're very sacred to the Rapa Nui. And so this project is a very small one, documenting those 7 ahus with the standing moy. And this is the only one where the moy is facing outward towards the ocean. All the rest face inward, and no one knows why. Now, one of the things I like to do is judge a people by their animals. For example, if you go to Moscow and you pet a dog, you will get bit and you will be getting rabies shots. But in Easter Island, all the dogs are wild and they are incredibly gentle and tame and friendly. They hang out at these ahus waiting for tourists to come by to feed them. And we fell in love with this guy. We call him Graybeard. And he was a mangy old guy, but he was so lovable. So twice a day we would come by with food and water to feed him. I was exhibiting my ancient stones work in Boulder, Colorado, when a woman comes up and stands next to me and says, you know, that image doesn't follow the rule of thirds, and you should never put your horizon on the center line. And I was astounded. She could not see the image. All she could see was rules not followed. So sort of in jest, I created my own rule of thirds, which states, a great image consists of 1/3 vision, 1/3 the shot, and 1/3 processing. But it's the vision that drives the shot and drives the processing. Without vision, technical perfection without vision will result in a technically perfect but soulless image. Lenny, a portrait of breast cancer. Lenny was a customer. She had purchased the Angel Gabriel, and about a year later, she calls me up and says, I've got breast cancer. I've had a mastectomy. I think there is good from that being photographed, and I want you to do it. Well, I apologize for her bad fortune, but explained that I really didn't do that type of work. And she says, no, I want you to do it. And I said, well, Lenny, let me give you the name of a woman who specializes in this type of work. No, I want you to do it. Lenny, I don't really have any experience in photographing people or portraiture or lighting. She goes, it'll be okay. I want you to do it. I couldn't get out of it. So off I went to Grand Junction, Colorado to photograph Lenny. She was beautiful. She was dignified. And it was an uncomfortable shoot for me. I'd never done anything like that. And I can't imagine how it was for her. And all through the shoot, I had one burning question that I wanted to ask, but feared not for ruining the mood of the shoot. But finally, as we got to the end, as I was getting ready to put my gear away, I asked her my question. Lenny, what is your prognosis? And she said, I'll be dead by Christmas. That was some 12 years ago, and Lenny is still with us. She got into an experimental program in Texas and is alive, is healthy, a renewed vigor for life, and a full head of hair. And she's now calling me, asking me to come photograph her again with hair. I don't know if you've experienced this, but I did. People are always telling me what I should do with my images. They might just outright come out and say, here's what you should do. But sometimes they were a little more subtle and would say, well, if it were my image, here's what I would do. Don't follow other people's advice, not about your vision. When I created the Angel Gabriel, I had a mentor. And the first thing, I was so proud of this image. The first time I had created something from vision, and I showed it to her, and she said, never center the image. I'm always telling you that, Cole. Don't center your images. Well, she had pretty good credentials, so I felt that I had to at least listen and explore what she said. So I went home and tried cropping it, and it felt wrong. It made me physically ill to see it this way, because this is how I had seen that image. She might have created it differently, but it was my image and my vision. There are no experts when it comes to your vision. Another story. A photographer was exhibiting his work for the very first time. An art critic, somewhat known, was in attendance, and he approached the photographer and said, "Would you like to hear my opinion of your work?" "Sure," said the photographer. "It's worthless," said the art critic. "I know," said the photographer, "but let's hear it anyway." You are the only expert when it comes to your vision. And don't ask other people what you should do with your images. People ask me, and the first thought I have is, you don't know what you should do you? How terrible that must be to have an image and not know what it should look like. I tell people, if I were to give you advice and you followed it, soon your images would look like mine, and you don't want that. Confucius say, "They who walk in another's footsteps never finds their own path." Moi, sitting for portrait. The third series from Easter Island. Getting to Easter Island is difficult. I flew from, it's not really difficult, I guess I should say it's long. I flew from Denver to Toronto, then to Santiago, then out to Easter Island. It's a very long trip. And on that long leg, I slept and dreamt. And interestingly, I dreamt that the Moi were alive and that I had brought 2 stands and a big roll of paper and set up an outdoor studio. Then I went around to the Moi inviting them to come and sit for a portrait. And most declined. Most were suspicious because they had been treated so ill by outsiders in the past. But many were old and some were infirm, and a lot didn't want to run into some other family clan members who they had disputes with. So I was really worried that no one would show up. So on the day of the portraits, nobody came. And then slowly, a few of the younger Moi started to show up. And as word got out, more and more of the Moi started to attend. Well, I woke up, told my wife this story, and then thought about it and said, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to invite the Moi to come and sit for a portrait. And I did. And of course, I didn't really have the Moi come and sit for a portrait, but I shot them outdoors and then used a digital backdrop to make it look as though they had sat for a portrait. And I had no experience with lighting or portraiture, so I had to just really research what a portrait lighting would look like and try to recreate that in Photoshop. But I had that vision of what it would look like. Here's a before and after. Now remember, these guys are tall. The tallest is 35 feet tall. These are giants. And this portfolio was published in Lenswork. Just let go. Letting go was one of the biggest keys to finding my vision. I had to let go of what other people thought of my work. I had to let go of conforming what everyone else was doing, let go of following the rules, of worrying if others would like my work, of trying to win contests. I had to let go of getting likes on social media or photographing the right way. I had to let go of trying to please others. Let go of other people's expectations. Let go of the fear of criticism. Really let go of everything. And once I did that, I was free. Once you don't care, you can photograph anything that you want in any way that you want. Vision is what's left over when you remove all of your fears and insecurities. When you stop complying and conforming, when you ignore what others are doing and you pursue what you love. The Faroe Islands. I kind of fell in love with the TV show Shetland on BBC. And whenever I watch one of these shows out in the middle of nowhere, I'm always looking in the background to see if it's a spot I'd like to go and photograph. And the Shetland Islands really got me excited. It looked very isolated, lots of coastline, a lot of rugged coast. And so I decided I was going to go to the Shetland Islands. Well, I get on Google Maps to find out where it's at. And I get distracted because I see something even more isolated and more interesting looking, the Faroe Islands, a group of 17 little islands in the middle of nowhere between Iceland and Norway. And so off I went for a month. In some ways, the Faroe Islands is incredibly modern. It has undersea tunnels that connect many of the islands. But in other ways, you feel like you're in the 17th century with rock walls, sheep, and sod-covered roofs. And it's a gorgeous land with wild weather, ever-changing. If you don't like it in one island, go to another. So for a month, I just traveled about these islands photographing. One of the best trips I ever took. These are the conditions I was often photographing in. And this is a funny story. I was going out to photograph that spire there on the left. And I had gone out to the end of an island and driven to the end of the road, walked to the end of the path, and then was walking as far as I could in the pasture. When over this hill, I see two people walking towards me, and they were carrying tripods. So as I got closer, I said, "Howdy." And the person replied back, "Hi, Cole." Blew me away. But he had read my blog that I was going to be on the Faroe Islands and figured if he saw another photographer, there was a good chance it would be me. So how long do projects take? I've talked about a few that have taken years. But the truth is, they just take as long as they take. And that could also be in just a couple of hours. And I'd like to show you a project that I completed in less than 2 hours. The Ghost of Auschwitz-Birkenau. As mentioned, my son was in Ukraine, and while visiting him, we decided to hop next door to Poland and stayed at Krakow. And while there, the family was discussing what we should do, what we should see. And I knew that Auschwitz-Birkenau was there, but I did not want to go. I don't like sad stories, sad movies, sad places. But the family voted, and off we went. Well, we had all of our belongings with us, but I had not intended to photograph. I thought that it would be sacrilegious or perhaps irreverent to photograph there. But as we were getting off the tour bus, the bus driver noticed I was leaving my gear and insisted I take it. He would not be responsible. So I had my gear, but with no intention of photographing. Well, we began the tour, and here's how it starts. They show you this book, and imagine on the left, there is a black and white photograph of the prisoner, a beautiful photograph. I mean, a really beautiful black and white. And on the right, in beautiful penmanship, is the person's name, their family name, their profession, their belongings, everything about them. And your head starts to spin. Why are they taking such care to beautifully document a person that they are either going to work to death or gas? Then they take you into the room with the iconic piles. There is a pile of hair. There is a pile of glasses. There is a pile of bridge work yanked from the mouths of the dead. And I'm not claustrophobic, but at that point, I could not breathe. And I signaled to my family that I would go outside and they should continue with the tour. Once outside, I was walking along, catching my breath and just looking at my feet. And then I started thinking about my footsteps. Who else had taken these very same footsteps on the way to the gallows or walked in the same path as they went to the gas chamber? And I started asking myself metaphorically, I wondered if the spirits of the people who lived and died at Auschwitz-Birkenau still lingered here. And then this idea just popped into my head that I needed to photograph those ghosts. And so I just started photographing in long exposure the other visitors at the camp, turning them into ghosts, having them stand in proxy for those who had died at the camp. One of the biggest challenges I faced photographing, besides the limited time, we had 2 hours, was that the Europeans are so polite that when they see you set up your camera and tripod, they immediately clear out of the area. And of course, I needed them. So I devised this technique of turning my back to the camera and getting my cell phone out and talking very loudly, as they expect loud Americans to do, until the people slowly mingled back into the scene. And then with a remote shutter release, I took the picture. After an hour, 45 minutes at Auschwitz, we went to Birkenau for an additional hour, and I was able to create 15 images. This is the only one that includes a living person. And of course, the gas chamber, which I could not enter. I was exhibiting this work at the Dallas Holocaust Museum when I saw this woman being pushed around, looking at the images by a nurse. And I went up and introduced myself and said, "Hi, my name is Cole. These are my images." And then she raised this bony, crooked finger, shaking hand, and pointed at the images and said, "These are my images." Edith had been interned at Auschwitz-Birkenau and had survived. And it just blew my mind what it must be like to see those images. I was also fortunate enough to exhibit this work and to address 100 survivors at the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And it is such an amazing honor to shake their hands, to touch them, and to hear their stories first person. Just absolutely amazing. So, final tip. What's the easiest way to make money from fine art photography? Sell your equipment. There's no money in it. And that's not why I do it. And that's why I never went into photography as a living. I wanted to retain my passion for it. And I've never regretted that decision. So, summary. Three-legged dogs are awesome, and so is black and white. The real key is your vision. Forget the rules. Best to never learn them. Don't follow other people's advice about your vision. Learn to let go of everything. Keep things simple and listen to the music. Thank you so very much. Now I'm going to, I think, stop sharing my screen. And
Cole, we can't thank you enough. What incredible pictures, wonderful stories, and such an inspiration. Thank you so much
thanks,
for doing
Steve.
that.
Thank you for having me.
I know we have some questions which we'll get to, and if you guys liked Cole's presentation, and who wouldn't, please consider making a donation to the Maryland Food Bank. Again, there are just so many people out there in dire straits, and the lines are growing longer. $1 can help feed 3 people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Bruce. I know we've got some questions, and Cole, you may even want to mention about the raffle.
Yes, at the end of the Q&A, we're going to be giving away a copy of the Angel Gabriel. It's a little awkward how to do it with the webinar, but we've devised a way. And so that's after the Q&A or comments. If anyone has a comment, I'd be happy to entertain. Usually there's a few who want to attack me on photographic celibacy, and believe me, I understand, and I have thick skin, so feel free.
Well, what we'll do is we won't attack you, and we won't follow your advice because that was your recommendation, right? So we do have some technical questions to begin with, and I guess the best way to summarize this is about filters. Do you use a red filter, or do you use neutral density filters?
No, you can't really use a red filter when shooting in color. It would turn out all red, and I do shoot in color. And I do use neutral density filters. I've got a 5, 10, 13, 15, and 20, and a variable, my little ND filter kit that allows me to photograph under any condition. For as far as I can go, as long as probably 8 minutes is about as long as my camera will go without getting too much noise.
Good, good. And do you have any special technique for dodging and burning so that it doesn't look obvious and it blends in and looks natural?
I've got an article on my blog that someone could check out, but the biggest key is that Photoshop tends to default at 50%, and I'm usually dodging and burning at 1%. So 1% and go slow.
Great. And more of like on your travels, when you're away for a month, do you process your images as you go, or do you wait until you return home?
No, I generally wait till I return home. I might do just a couple on the iPhone, transfer them to my iPhone, and just so I can send them out maybe on a blog or to my family, but mostly at home.
Good stuff. All right, there was one more question here. And how do you verbalize your vision as an overall one, or for each portfolio or each image?
I've never even thought of that. I think my vision is just how I see things. And a lot of people think a vision is kind of limiting because it maybe you have to photograph in a certain way or a certain subject or a certain genre. And really the beauty of vision is that it frees you to photograph anything. You've seen the wide variety of my subject matter. I would never call myself a landscape photographer. I'm not a people photographer. I just can photograph anything that I want because my vision sees things anywhere, anything. So it's really freeing to find your vision. And a lot of people think that, you're supposed to focus on one thing and get good at it. I don't agree with that. I'd say follow your passion. Photograph what you're passionate about.
Okay, now for the off-the-wall question. Why did you let your hair grow out?
Starting with COVID. I haven't had a haircut since, I don't know, February.
Good stuff. See, maybe see we have more questions here. How do you name your photos? How do you give them those meaningful titles?
First thought that comes to mind.
Good stuff.
Well, while Steve's digging for some questions, Cole, I have a new vision, which is to try to travel with you. You go to some absolutely wonderful places. And I know this question is sort of unrelated to your presentation, but any tips on how to travel, when you go on a photography mission like that?
My biggest one is I like to go in September because kids have gone back to school and I can travel without hotel reservations. If I had to go in April, May, June, there's no way I could just travel and get a hotel anywhere I wanted. So September means less crowds, open hotels, more freedom. But it also means a great changing weather. It's usually, part summer, part autumn. You can get some good storms. So autumn is just late September is my favorite time to go to these exotic locations.
Maybe we'll sneak in one more question here with regard to your own photographic celibacy and how do you get around all the social media at this day and age? I know I find them bumping into pictures all the time and saying, how do I do that?
Well, if I am on social media, it's to post one image a week, which I let go here recently, but I don't look at any other people's work. I mean, I know it sounds crazy to people. I actually had a man in one of my presentations when they were live stand up and he goes, "You do what?" And I explained it and he goes, "Why on earth would you do that?" He goes, "I love looking at other images. It brings me joy." And my answer was because I want to find my vision more than I want to enjoy other people's photographs. And I've been doing this now, celibacy, for about 12 years. And I still find it wonderfully useful. It helps keep my mind clear of what others are doing. A short story. I had an image published in a book called Why Photographs Work. And the publisher sent me the book, and I was flipping through, looking through for mine, when I saw this image called Three Crosses by Brian Kosoff. 3 telephone poles on a dry, grassy hill in Northern California. Just fell in love with it. I contacted him, bought the image, hung it on my wall. And for the next several weeks, I'm driving along constantly looking for telephone poles that I can photograph like he did. And I'd catch myself and say, "Wait a minute, what are you doing? Brian's done that shot. It's not yours." But I'd still find myself trying to imitate it. I'm just naturally imitative, whether it'll someone's look or someone's image. And so I find celibacy to be very useful in keeping my head clear of that type of imitation.
Again, everybody, the Maryland Food Bank, if you choose to make a donation, your donation goes directly to the food bank, not through MPA. We set up a specific link with them, so we don't touch the money at all. And I do want to remind everybody about the Odyssey of Light. That will be a paid seminar, and it's really the only thing we do during the course of the year to support everything that MPA does, including Artist Spotlight. So you'll be receiving something on Odyssey within the next 10 days or so. Cole, again, we're going to keep this link up. The recording will be posted in approximately within a week. There's a URL on the screens, folks, so you can go into that URL, scroll down, and that's where our video library is located. Cole, we can't thank you enough for taking the time, helping generate some money for the Maryland Food Bank. So it was a absolutely incredible presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. And can you tell me, I'm looking at this screen, how do I make a donation? Is it under offers?
I think your screen will not show the chat window with the link, but I will email you the direct link to the Maryland Food Bank. So thank you for doing that.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.
And safe travels, Cole, and everybody be safe and healthy out there. Take care.